What's good? What's good? We're back. Chapter 20 of Black Fortunes. Let's get it. Paris by Way of Harlem. In July 1906, after the trial of Hannah Elias, two apartment buildings on West 135th Street in Harlem were purchased by an anonymous buyer through the Afro-American Realty Company for $100,000. A few days later, notes were slipped under the doors of white families in the buildings. The notes told them to vacate their homes within 24 hours and that in the future the dwellings would only be rented to respectable colored families. After the tenants got their eviction notices, the papers howled, "White tenants evicted by Hannah Elias." An article published in the New York Evening World read, "Hannah Elias, the negress that got $685,000 from John R. Platt, has jarred a goodly part of Harlem by ordering all the white tenants out of two big flat buildings." The article concluded that her move was part of a larger plot. This indicates that the wealthy colored woman will make a colored settlement out of one of the choicest neighborhoods above 125th Street. Elias denied having any part in the building purchases or the evictions, but she had indeed begun investing in Harlem with a handful of other powerful African Americans. The Upper Manhattan neighborhood was nearly all white, but changes were afoot. It stretched from the top of Central Park at 110th Street, 50 blocks north, to 160th Street, backing up to the deep woods that surrounded Fort Washington. The area was dotted with farms, Victorian mansions, wood frame homes with lawns, new brownstones, and empty lots on a grid of tree-lined streets. Andrew Green, the New York City planner, whose murder Elias had indirectly been involved in, had facilitated the development of two elevated trains that connected Harlem to Lower Manhattan. When the commuter rails had opened at the turn of the century, they had set off waves of migration to Harlem. The first migrants were white Manhattanites, Eastern Europeans, and Italian immigrants. They were followed a few years later by middle-class African Americans. Blacks began moving to Harlem with the help of an African American real estate developer named Philip A. Payton Jr. and his company, the Afro-American Realty Company. The first African American migrants to Harlem came from Greenwich Village in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and met resistance from whites as soon as they arrived. Their presence is undesirable among us in Harlem, an entry in the New York Indicator, a Manhattan real estate journal, stated, adding that blacks should be segregated into some colony on the outskirts of the city, where their transportation and other problems will not inflict injustice and disgust on other worthy citizens. As the Afro-American Realty Company helped blacks move into Lower Harlem, the neighborhood's white citizens organized to prevent blacks from moving deeper in. Led by John G. Tyler, a white separatist, Harlemite, and real estate developer, a slew of anti-black, anti-integration proponents quickly began to organize. The Save Harlem Committee, Anglo-Saxon Realty, and the Harlem Property Owners Association. After blacks rapidly moved into Lower Harlem after the opening of the train station at 125th Street in 1905, whites focused their efforts on preventing blacks from encroaching higher, drawing a line at 130th Street, which served as the border between integrated and non-integrated Harlem. In 1909, white Harlemites successfully lobbied the New York Public Library on 135th Street to ban blacks from using the facilities. In 1912, a group of wealthy white industrialists, including the department store magnate Erduin van der Horstcoach, forced the eviction of black tenants on 131st and 132nd Streets and blocked a black movie theater from opening on Lenox Avenue near 130th Street. Although some elite African Americans such as Elias had luck early on buying property in White Harlem, above 130th Street. As the white residents organized, others found it impossible to penetrate the upper portion of the neighborhood, which had wider streets and larger homes. In 1911, John Nell, one of the top agents of the Afro-American Realty Company, left to form his own real estate business. In his new endeavor, he had one very wealthy client to note, Hannah Elias. Nell was a handsome man with brown skin, a round face, and curly brown hair, who wore bespoke suits and highly polished shoes. He came from a prestigious family and was the brother-in-law of the NAACP's James Weldon Johnson. He and Elias became friends after her trial. With his smarts and clients like Elias, Nell had a plan to begin to bypass the color line at 130th Street and become the biggest real estate agent in Harlem. Nell had a secret weapon, his pastor, Reverend Hutchins C. Bishop. Bishop presided over St. Philip's Episcopal Church, of which Nell and Elias were both members. With his olive-colored skin, blue eyes, straight nose, square jaw, and straight brown hair, which he slicked tightly back, Bishop could pass for a white man. He was descended from free blacks in Baltimore and considered his church a high church, recruiting upper-class African Americans such as Elias and Nell to his flock. St. Philip's Episcopal Church became famous among African Americans during the Civil War draft riots in 1863. When more than 100 black New Yorkers were killed by mobs and the property of famous African Americans such as Jeremiah Hamilton and James McCune Smith was attacked. During the riots, thousands of blacks sheltered in St. Philip's, which had stone walls and thick wooden doors. In 1906, as his flock swelled to more than 1,000 souls, Bishop decided to move to a larger church in Harlem. In 1906, Nell and Bishop sold his church building in Hell's Kitchen for $600,000, which today would be $16.2 million, and purchased a new church on 135th Street in White Harlem. Bishop went by himself to purchase the church and put the building into his own name. Looking into the Reverend's sparkling blue eyes, the sellers never imagined they were selling to a black man, let alone a large black church congregation. After purchasing the church, Bishop and Nell bought 6 more apartments in White Harlem using the same scheme. After Nell established his own company with Elias's financial backing, he deployed Bishop as a straw buyer, gobbling up dozens of properties. Once they had acquired properties, Nell began renting and selling them to African Americans. His first customers were upper-class African Americans from the neighborhoods of Williamsburg and downtown Brooklyn, where he had grown up. Nell sold them lots for $1,000 to $3,000 to build homes on. After the draft riots, affluent African Americans, many of whose families and businesses had been attacked by mobs, had fled Manhattan for Brooklyn. Nell successfully recruited dozens of affluent black families back to Manhattan, promising them that Harlem would be a haven for blacks on the island. Later, he bought and built apartment buildings and rented apartments to working-class African Americans who were turned away by white landlords in other areas of New York. Between 1911 and 1914, he bought up more than $1.1 million, which would be approximately $27.6 million today, worth of property in Harlem. With the help of Elias and Bishop, he helped break the color line at 130th Street and turned Harlem into a bustling black enclave. After their affair and resulting scandal, Elias's ex-lover, John Platt, stayed in New York City and moved to Upper Manhattan, living with one of his daughters. "I've got to stay and face the music," he told friends and family members. "I've got to stay and face the music," he told friends and family members. He appealed the decision to dismiss his blackmail charge against Elias in court, but lost. He remained estranged from her after taking her to court, but kept tabs on her activities in the paper. He read stories about her whenever they were published. In 1908, he died of a heart attack at the age of 89. He left nothing to Elias in his will. She knew better than to attend his funeral. Platt's estate was worth $10,000, or about $270,000 at the time of his death. It seemed that the former millionaire had transferred the majority of his wealth to Elias during their affair. In 1910, Elias left her mansion at Central Park West and moved to a penthouse of an apartment building she owned on 113th and Broadway with her butler, Cato. In Harlem, she did not have to shutter her windows or hide her face behind a veil. For a time, she felt free. After a few years, the knocks on the door began. As the best-known wealthy black woman in New York, she was constantly harassed by people looking for charity and sheriff's deputies serving her with lawsuits. She was sued by her lawyers and contractors who said she owed them money for work they did for her. She brought a parakeet that she kept in a golden cage, which she screamed at when she was upset, and spent hours at a time berating and taking out her frustrations on Cato. In time, she began to seclude herself in her penthouse, the same way she had in her mansion. In 1918, his company continued to sell to African Americans and build apartments. Nell, like many other African American soldiers, was disappointed as he read about continued lynching and voter suppression in black newspapers and the syndicated columns of Ida B. Wells. In 1921, as he was returning hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions today, to Hannah Elias and Prophet, the race riots in Greenwood hit the papers. On June 10th, the New York Age, Harlem's paper of record, carried the headline on its front page: Oklahoma whites attempt to destroy entire Negro section. Extra, 75 dead, both races, many wounded. In the months after the riots, a handful of African American survivors from Tulsa showed up in Harlem. Nell helped them get settled and found them apartments. Harlem became a destination for the black elite, with Madam C.J. Walker's family moving to the neighborhood in 1910 and Robert Reed Church's son, Thomas Church, moving there in 1919. In 1923, Elias decided to leave the United States. She took a car to New York Pier and waited for a cruise liner that would carry her to Europe. She was accompanied by Cato, her butler and loyal companion. Elias planned to travel to France, where Nell had friends from World War I who had stayed in Europe after the war deployment. The black ex-soldiers stayed in Montmartre, Bohemia, on a hilltop overlooking Paris, where people from various backgrounds lived together. When their ship arrived at New York Harbor, Elias and Cato boarded and sailed across the Atlantic. Some people who knew her said she lived to an old age in the south of France. Others said she died in Paris a few years after arriving. One rumor said she had taken $1 million with her. Others cited the numerous lawsuits against her, insisting that she had been down to her last penny by the time she left. The one thing no one can disagree on is that she disappeared. When the newspapers learned of her departure, they went to John Nell's office and inquired about his business associates' whereabouts. Nell told them nothing other than Hannah Elias has left. Elias had finally gotten what she wanted. No one could bother her, wherever she was. And that was chapter 20. So I'm from Harlem, and I enjoy learning about the history of where I'm from. I enjoy that so much. I can do deep dives on Harlem, and my grandmother actually tells me a lot of stories about Harlem. So this is going to be a good segue into my next video. I interviewed my grandmother, and yeah, so we're going to hear about her experiences in Harlem growing up and everything like that. And then I'll do my own experiences in Harlem. My grandmother was born in 1944, so it'll be her experiences growing up in Harlem in the 1950s, a little bit about that, and then my experiences growing up in Harlem in the 1990s, early 2000s. But yeah, that was chapter 20. Peace. Okay, we are just about finished with Black Fortunes. We are wrapping it up right now. We are on the epilogue. Let's get it. As fate would have it, the nominal wealth of most of the individuals profiled in this book faded after their deaths, yet their legacies endure. Mary Ellen Pleasant left a large estate worth nearly $300,000, which would be about $8.4 million today, when she died, but she had no heirs to bequeath her fortune to. Her only daughter, Lizzie J. Smith, died when she was a young woman in San Francisco, years before her mother. Pleasant's estate was consumed by her numerous creditors and complainants after she died in 1904. Robert Reed Church left hundreds of his residential properties in the Beale Street district of Memphis to the children of his first marriage, Mary Church Terrell and Thomas Ayers Church. At the time of their inheritance, the values of these properties were declining, due in part to Beale Street itself, which was once again being maligned as a black slum and vice district. Mary and Thomas thrived despite their diminished inheritance. Mary became a teacher and a prominent suffragette and civil rights activist. Thomas became a lawyer and publisher. Robert Reed Church left the bulk of his liquid assets to his second wife, Anna Church, and their children, Annette Church and Robert Reed Church Jr., who used their father's bequest to maintain the family's commercial property business on Beale Street. Church Jr. leased property to clubs and concert halls as Beale Street became the Mecca of blues music, eventually serving as the launching pad for W.C. Handy and B.B. King. In doing so, he was part of establishing the black entertainment industry, which today is responsible for the majority of Black America's very richest entrepreneurs, including Oprah Winfrey, Bob Johnson, Tyler Perry, and Katie Hughes. Church Jr. died in 1952, leaving one daughter, Sarah Roberta Church. When she died in 1995, after a career working as an administrator for the federal government, she was the last known surviving direct descendant of Robert Reed Church Sr. O.W. Gurley had most of his wealth destroyed in the fires and the violence of the Tulsa race riots in 1921. Afterward, he moved to a 4-bedroom house in South Los Angeles and opened a small hotel that he operated with his wife, Emma. Gurley was never able to rebuild his wealth to the level it had reached in Tulsa. The couple had no children and left a modest estate to their extended family members. Hannah Elias disappeared from public life after she moved to Europe. What she did after she left is still a mystery. Nonetheless, her most notable achievement was in helping convert Harlem into a black Mecca. Today, Harlem remains one of America's most prominent black neighborhoods. When was this book written? Because Harlem is definitely gentrified. Now, when Annie Malone died of a stroke in 1954, she left behind a diminished estate, approximately $100,000 or $906,000 today, coming after years of expenses from the management fees of her company and an expensive divorce from Aaron Malone. As she had no children, her estate was split between her nieces and nephews. Many of the industries these men and women pioneered are still relevant today. Real estate, which played a role in the development of the fortunes of almost all the dynamic personalities in this book, is still an outsized component of African American wealth. Since Reconstruction, Black people have, on average, as a group, invested a larger percentage of their net worth in real estate than any other group. There may be many economic and social reasons for this, but perhaps one in particular is that for African Americans, owning one's land after toiling tirelessly over it as enslaved farmers and then sharecroppers is an affirmation of liberation. That being said, the 2008 financial crisis dealt a blow to this economic tradition, as African Americans were disproportionately affected by both the fraudulent lending practices that helped create the crisis and the foreclosures that resulted. Today, the Black home ownership rate is around 43%, nearly the lowest for African Americans in modern history. Madam C.J. Walker's and Annie Malone's businesses created the Black hair and beauty industry, which today is worth nearly $700 million. Surprisingly, the Black hair industry today is not dominated by African American companies or even American companies, but rather by foreign firms. South Korea and Chinese companies that manufacture products like wigs, hair extensions, and chemical straighteners dominate the Black hair sector. The trend, however, may be reversing as more Black women are choosing to wear their hair natural, just as Annie Malone advocated more than 130 years ago. Mary Ellen Pleasant and Jeremiah Hamilton were pioneers as Black stock and commodity traders. They paved the way for investors like Robert F. Smith, who today is one of America's most successful investors and worth nearly $3 billion. African Americans have historically underinvested in the markets, due in no small part to the legacy of Jim Crow-era Black bans on Wall Street, which early investors like Jeremiah Hamilton, Mary Ellen Pleasant, and my great-great-uncle John Mott Drew had to circumvent just to get in the game. In recent years, the racial investment gap has been closing. Despite this progress, Black investment managers are still underrepresented, with only a little over 1% of all assets in the United States being managed by Black firms and brokers. During their lives, Mary Ellen Pleasant, Robert Reed Church, Ottawa W. Gurley, Annie Malone, Hannah Elias, and Madam C.J. Walker were pioneers and inspirations to other African Americans and their allies, while to others they were upenders of a racist social order. Slavery and Jim Crow were not just social atrocities, but also economic institutions meant to create a marginally compensated black labor class. As enslaved African Americans became paid tenant farmers after emancipation, their wages were garnished by plantation owners. Blacks who managed to own their farms faced constant racial harassment and threats from white supremacist groups. African American inventors were often denied patents or had their intellectual property stolen. The black wealthy class perhaps represented the greatest affront to the racist economic systems of the slave and Jim Crow eras. It is perhaps for this reason that the 6 individuals in this book faced assassination attempts, mob violence, threats, libel, and slander. Yet they persevered to contribute to their communities and bring about some of America's proudest moments, such as the abolition of slavery, the suffrage of women, and the establishment of some of the country's most important cities and industries. These individuals' lives demonstrate that wealth can be used as a powerful resource for change in the right hands, if people are so willing. The stories of the first black millionaires in America are the beginning of an epic that is still unfolding, the journey from enslavement to economic and social equality. Their unlikely lives provided a spark for a people just beginning to lift themselves out of bondage and still serve as inspiration for minorities and women as they strive for greater financial empowerment today. And that was the end of Black Fortunes. Let me know what you thought about the book. Are you inspired? Had you heard about these people already? Let's talk. Peace.